We often like to think that history moves in a straight line, that the horrors and mistakes of the past remain behind us, sealed in textbooks and documentaries. Yet today, prominent voices such as Yanis Varoufakis and Gillian Tett are warning that a pre-1945 world, one characterized by geopolitical fragmentation, aggressive nationalism, and economic instability, may be re-emerging. This is not merely a cautionary tale. It is a reflection of observable trends in global politics, trade disputes, and the resurgence of authoritarianism. The question we must ask ourselves is stark. Are we repeating patterns once thought relegated to the history books, or are we simply blind to the evolving complexities of a new world order? The post-World War II international system was built on unprecedented cooperation, multilateral institutions, and shared rules designed to prevent the kind of chaos that engulfed Europe and much of Asia in the first half of the 20th century. Economically, politically, and diplomatically, nations were interwoven in alliances and agreements that incentivized stability and collective problem-solving. But today, we observe cracks in these structures. Trade wars, withdrawal from multilateral agreements, and rising protectionism undermine the mechanisms designed to keep conflicts in check. Tett's analysis highlights that these shifts are not temporary blips. They reflect a deeper reorientation of global power, where national interest increasingly supersedes collective security and mutual accountability. Varoufakis emphasizes the economic dimensions of this transformation. He warns that the world is witnessing a revival of economic nationalism, reminiscent of the pre-1945 era when countries pursued autarky and competitive devaluation to secure advantage. Financial interdependence, once a stabilizing force, is being undermined by unilateral policies, sanctions, and fragmented supply chains. This, in turn, threatens the global economic balance, increasing the potential for conflict as nations vie for limited resources and leverage in an increasingly unstable environment. The warnings are clear. Without deliberate, coordinated efforts to reinforce multilateral norms, the world risks sliding into patterns of rivalry and volatility that history has already shown to be catastrophic. The implications of these developments extend beyond the halls of government or the trading floors of Wall Street. Ordinary citizens experience the consequences through rising prices, insecurity in employment, and the erosion of trust in institutions. Social cohesion, the backbone of resilient societies, is tested when political leaders prioritize short-term nationalist gains over systemic stability. Understanding the lessons of history is essential, not as a mere academic exercise, but as a guide for contemporary decision-making. Ignoring these warnings risks repeating the very conflicts, inequalities, and upheavals that shaped the 20th century. We stand at a pivotal moment. The choices made by leaders, economists, and citizens today will determine whether we uphold the post-war principles that fostered peace and prosperity, or whether we slide back into a world marked by fragmentation, rivalry, and uncertainty. Recognizing the signs highlighted by Varoufakis and Tett is the first step. Engagement, strategic cooperation, and a commitment to institutional frameworks are essential if we are to navigate this moment responsibly. History does not repeat itself automatically, but it offers patterns, warnings, and guidance that we would be reckless to ignore. The stakes could not be higher, and the time to act is now. Resurgence of pre-1945 patterns. The warning that a pre-1945 world is re-emerging reflects a profound concern about the global trajectory of politics and economics. Before 1945, the international system was characterized by intense nationalism, fragmented alliances, and frequent conflicts over territory, resources, and influence. This was a world in which power was zero-sum, cooperation was minimal, and the stability of nations rested largely on military capability rather than on structured multilateral agreements or shared norms. Varoufakis and Gillian Tett suggest that contemporary trends are echoing these dynamics as countries increasingly prioritize national self-interest over collective security and global stability. The rise of authoritarian governance, the erosion of international institutions, and the increasing willingness to act unilaterally all signal a departure from the cooperative order that dominated much of the post-war era. Nationalism, once considered a destabilizing force of the past, is now manifesting in renewed forms. Leaders are appealing to domestic constituencies by emphasizing national sovereignty, economic self-reliance and protectionist measures, often at the expense of international collaboration. Trade disputes and economic sanctions have become common tools of statecraft, echoing the protectionist policies that contributed to global instability in the early 20th century. Tett's analysis highlights that these measures are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader shift in global norms, reflecting an environment where global coordination is increasingly deprioritized and competitive advantage takes precedence. Similarly, geopolitical fragmentation is becoming more pronounced. Alliances that once ensured mutual security and collective problem-solving are being questioned or weakened. Countries are reevaluating commitments to multilateral organizations, questioning obligations to defense pacts, and increasingly seeking bilateral agreements that serve narrow national interests. This mirrors the pre-1945 landscape, where fragmented diplomacy and shifting alliances made conflict more likely and reduced opportunities for coordinated responses to crises. The re-emergence of these dynamics carries significant risks. Political actors may underestimate how interconnected the modern world remains, assuming that unilateral actions will not have cascading effects. Yet global supply chains, financial systems, and international security arrangements create vulnerabilities that did not exist in the same way a century ago. Despite these differences, the underlying patterns of self-interest, rivalry, and instability bear a striking resemblance to the conditions that contributed to global conflict before 1945. Recognizing these parallels is essential for understanding the fragility of contemporary international relations and the potential consequences of neglecting systemic cooperation in favor of short-term national gain. The erosion of post-World War II institutions represents a central concern in the current global landscape. After 1945, multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were established to create frameworks for cooperation, conflict resolution, and economic stability. Regional alliances such as NATO and the European Union further reinforced norms of collective security and mutual accountability. These institutions function not merely as bureaucratic mechanisms, but as structural safeguards, embedding rules and procedures that help prevent the type of widespread conflict and economic chaos that characterized the first half of the 20th century. However, today these institutions are under unprecedented strain. Trade wars, unilateral withdrawal from international agreements, and increasing skepticism toward global governance signal a weakening of these structures. Countries are less willing to accept the constraints imposed by multilateral frameworks when they perceive them as limiting national sovereignty or economic advantage. Gillian Tett emphasizes that this erosion is not superficial, it is structural, reflecting a growing preference for short-term, politically expedient strategies over long-term stability. Institutions that once coordinated collective action now struggle to enforce compliance, mediate disputes, or provide economic and diplomatic guidance with credibility. The mechanisms that fostered cooperation are being undermined from within, leaving gaps that can be exploited by states pursuing narrow self-interest. The weakening of these institutions has cascading effects on global stability. Without effective multilateral oversight, disputes between nations over trade, resources, and security are more likely to escalate rather than be resolved diplomatically. Rules-based systems designed to regulate financial flows, trade agreements, and security obligations are increasingly bypassed, creating uncertainty that reverberates through markets, supply chains, and political relationships. Varoufakis underscores the economic dimension of this breakdown. When countries act unilaterally, the predictability that underpins global investment, trade, and economic cooperation diminishes, increasing volatility and the risk of financial crises. Moreover, the erosion of post-war institutions signals a shift in the international balance of power. Emerging economies and regional actors are asserting themselves more aggressively, challenging the norms that were previously maintained by a cooperative framework dominated by Western powers. The combination of institutional weakening, rising nationalism, and fragmented diplomacy creates an environment in which global coordination is increasingly difficult, and the potential for conflict or economic disruption rises. The post-1945 system, designed to mitigate exactly these risks, is under stress, highlighting the fragility of contemporary global governance and the need to rethink mechanisms for collective stability in an era marked by unilateralism and uncertainty. The rise of economic nationalism is a defining feature of the emerging global order and a significant concern highlighted by Varoufakis. Unlike the post-1945 era, in which countries increasingly embraced interdependence and international trade as stabilizing forces, today nations are increasingly prioritizing self-interest and short-term economic advantage over cooperation. Policies designed to secure domestic markets, protect local industries, and reduce reliance on foreign partners echo the strategies of the interwar period, when competitive protectionism and autarky contributed to economic instability and global conflict. Economic nationalism undermines the mechanisms that historically facilitated growth, stability, and peaceful cooperation, creating conditions where rivalry often supersedes collaboration. The tools of economic nationalism are multifaceted. Trade barriers, tariffs, and sanctions are used not only to protect domestic industries but also to exert political pressure, creating a landscape in which economic decision-making is entangled with strategic rivalry. Countries increasingly seek to control critical resources and supply chains to reduce vulnerability to external shocks, sometimes at the expense of efficiency, competitiveness, and long-term global stability. Varoufakis warns that these measures, while politically expedient, risk destabilizing international financial systems by creating uncertainty in trade flows, investment, and currency markets. Supply chains, which modern economies rely on for cost efficiency and innovation, become fragmented, reducing productivity and heightening vulnerability to shocks. Economic nationalism also has social and political consequences. When governments frame domestic prosperity in opposition to global integration, they often stoke nationalist sentiment, undermining trust in international institutions and inflaming public skepticism toward cooperation. Tet emphasizes that these ideological shifts can further erode the multilateral frameworks built to prevent conflict, creating a feedback loop in which economic and political rivalries reinforce one another. This dynamic mirrors the pre-1945 world, in which protectionist policies and nationalistic priorities contributed to economic polarization and ultimately global instability. The combination of rising protectionism, fractured trade networks, and unilateral economic action threatens to destabilize not only markets, but also the broader political landscape. Economic interdependence, once considered a stabilizing factor, is being undermined, increasing the likelihood of disputes escalating into broader conflicts. The resurgence of economic nationalism illustrates the ways in which historical patterns are resurfacing, demonstrating that global economic decisions cannot be separated from political and security considerations. Understanding the systemic implications of these policies is essential for navigating the current environment and avoiding the repetition of past mistakes. The impact of political and economic instability on societies and citizens is immediate, pervasive, and often underestimated in policy discussions. When nations prioritize short-term self-interest, unilateral action, and economic nationalism over multilateral cooperation, the consequences are felt not only in international markets, but directly in the lives of ordinary people. Rising tariffs, disrupted trade networks, and fragmented supply chains increase the cost of goods and services, reduce employment opportunities, and heighten uncertainty in labor markets. For households, these shifts can translate into diminished purchasing power, job insecurity, and stress over the reliability of essential resources, creating social pressures that extend far beyond the immediate economic sphere. The erosion of trust in institutions is a critical component of these dynamics. Citizens observe that global frameworks designed to ensure stability and fairness, whether trade agreements, international regulatory bodies, or cooperative security arrangements, are increasingly sidelined or weakened. This perception can foster skepticism toward governance, both domestically and internationally, as people begin to doubt whether political and economic systems serve their interests or merely those of elites and powerful states. Ted emphasizes that this erosion of institutional trust can exacerbate social divisions, heighten polarization, and make populations more receptive to nationalist rhetoric, further reinforcing the cycle of instability. Moreover, economic and political instability affects social cohesion and community resilience. Uncertainty in markets and employment often disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations, widening inequalities and placing pressure on public services and social support systems. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure, all of which depend on stable governance and predictable economic conditions, become harder to maintain, compounding the long-term consequences of short-term policy choices. These disruptions are not contained within national borders, as global interdependence ensures that shocks reverberate across regions, creating cross-border economic and social stress. The experience of ordinary citizens under these conditions mirrors historical patterns observed before 1945, when instability, protectionism, and nationalist competition contributed to widespread social and economic dislocation. By understanding the human consequences of these macro-level decisions, policymakers can appreciate that the stakes are not abstract numbers on a balance sheet or geopolitical posturing. They are the livelihoods, security, and well-being of real communities. Varoufakis warns that ignoring these societal dimensions risks amplifying crises, as populations react to uncertainty and insecurity in ways that may further destabilize political systems and international relations. Recognizing the interplay between systemic instability and its human impact is essential for creating policies that not only address national priorities, but also protect citizens from the unintended consequences of fragmented global governance. The urgency for coordinated action in today's world cannot be overstated, as the combination of rising nationalism, economic fragmentation, and weakened institutions creates a landscape fraught with risk. Varoufakis and Tet emphasize that without deliberate and strategic engagement, the trends echoing the pre-1945 era may accelerate, undermining decades of international stability. Policymakers, economists, and civil society must recognize that collective challenges, ranging from financial crises to resource competition and security threats, cannot be addressed by unilateral measures alone. The mechanisms of cooperation that were painstakingly constructed after World War II remain essential, and their erosion leaves nations more vulnerable to both predictable and unforeseen crises. Strategic cooperation requires more than adherence to formal agreements. It demands proactive dialogue, shared problem-solving, and the willingness to prioritize systemic stability over narrow national advantage. Multilateral frameworks provide platforms for negotiation, conflict resolution, and coordinated economic planning, reducing the likelihood that disagreements escalate into broader confrontations. By engaging consistently with these institutions, nations reinforce norms that mitigate risk and create predictable environments for trade, investment, and security. Tet notes that when such structures are respected and strengthened, the incentives for aggressive unilateral action diminish, as countries recognize the benefits of reciprocity and trust in collective frameworks. Economic interdependence, once perceived as a stabilizing force, must be actively managed rather than taken for granted. Coordinated action includes the establishment of rules that govern trade, investment, and financial flows to prevent destabilizing competition or market manipulation. Varoufakis highlights that unilateral economic nationalism disrupts these flows, increasing volatility and reducing predictability. By contrast, policy alignment and multilateral coordination help preserve global stability, mitigate shocks, and provide mechanisms for dispute resolution without resorting to conflict. This requires a conscious effort to integrate economic strategy with diplomatic engagement and security considerations, ensuring that national policies do not unintentionally destabilize the broader international system. Civil society and public institutions also have a role in fostering accountability and vigilance. Citizens must be aware of the systemic risks posed by fragmented governance, rising nationalism, and protectionist policies. Advocacy, informed debate, and pressure on policymakers to uphold cooperative norms are essential to sustaining institutions that prevent conflict and promote prosperity. Coordinated action, therefore, is both a top-down and bottom-up imperative, requiring commitment from leaders and populations alike. The future stability of the international system depends on whether such engagement is embraced or ignored, and whether historical lessons are applied proactively rather than retrospectively.